los campos fuera, brotó la muerte y nos cerró el amor. Dulces los oros en la propia patria, donde es amigo con dolor brazos. Vida es la brisa que en sus campos vuela, grota la muerte y más tierno el amor. Ardientes besos en los labios juegan de una madre en el seno al despertar. Buscan los labios a tener el cuello y los ojos sonríense al mirar. Ardientes besos en los labios juegan de una madre en el seno despertar. Buscan los brazos a tener el cuello y los ojos sonríense al mirar. Dulce es la muerte por la propia patria, donde es amigo la paloma el sol. Muerte es la presa para que no tiene una patria, una madre, un amor. Dulce es la muerte por la propia patria, donde es amigo cuando nombra el sol. Muerte es la presa para quien no tiene una patria, una madre, un amor. Muerte es la presa para quien no tiene una patria, una madre y un amor.
Our topic for today is linked to Rizal, but it's about the person who has probably done the most outside the Philippines to promote Rizal as a thinker, Benedict Anderson. So Anderson, a world-renowned political scientist whose book Imagine Communities is one of the most cited in the world in many areas of social science and cultural studies, was deeply fascinated with Jose Rizal and his novels. Two historians will share not just how Anderson used Rizal's works to interrogate the complexities of nationalism and resistance in Southeast Asia, but also anecdotes of Anderson's incursions into Filipino culture. I must say they're not just two historians; they were two very good friends of Ben, and Jojo was a student of Anderson's. Ambeth was more like a teacher of Anderson's, actually. So we will begin with Ambeth Ocampo, who actually needs no introduction. But anyway, Ambeth Ocampo is the Philippines' premier public historian. There's no equivocation there, by the way. Ocampo is Senator Hill J. Puyat Professor at the Ateneo de Manila University and editorial page columnist of the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He has published 35 books, including the classic Rizal Without the Overcoat, that has been in print over several editions since it was first published in 1990. He previously served as chairman of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and concurrently as chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. He moderates a growing Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channels. Ambeth.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much for joining our panel. I'm going to leave the more complicated stuff to Professor Claudio and Professor Abinales. I want to just do the personal. How I met Benedict Anderson. I met him in 1988. He attended lecture I was giving on Andres Bonifacio, and I was introduced to him by Glenn May, who also wrote a controversial book on Andres Bonifacio. I did not know who he was until many years later. He says, you know, I've read your books. Can we talk about Rizal? That's interesting. And he says, I want to sit in your undergraduate Rizal class. So I told him, yes, I teach in UP, but I didn't give him the correct schedule and the correct classroom number. But he was able to find it. And so one day he turned up in my class wearing shorts. You know, he just looked like some European tourist who was overstaying in the Philippines. So he sat in and he was more interested in Rizal than my students were. And what I learned from him at that time was he had, not only was he interested in Rizal's life and writings, he explored in many different ways. So one of his wonderful questions were things like, do you think Rizal dreamt in color or in black and white? For which we have no answer, right? And so this would always be the start of a conversation. And I'd like to think that was part of Anderson's research method, to look at things beyond what you're seeing, to see things from a different angle. And so we went up. I brought him to Rizal's house in Calamba. We went through the house, and again, his next question was, did Rizal use underwear? No, a question, again, I did not have the answer to, but we did the research. And not only did we visit Rizal's house in Calamba, we actually went up to Lecheria Hill to look at the Rizalista church, where you will see in the main altar, it's an angel with Jose Rizal on the main altar. So we went there, looked around, and over that, we started to visit many different places, Rizal-related places, historically important places. Like one of the places I brought him to was Biak na Bato, which I had never visited. So I said, let's see where this Biak na Bato is. There was not much traffic in the 80s, so I was able to drive all the way from Quezon City to Biak na Bato. And we walked around. We didn't know it was a park. We didn't know it had caves. So we walked in the water. I was in pants. We were not prepared to swim, but we just walked in. And people were very worried that you cannot be walking in the hinterlands of Bulacan. There's NPA in the hinterlands, and you're walking with a white man. I said, no, I have my UP ID. That will probably save me from the NPA, but if you have military who will accost us, I will show my Ateneo ID and get things done. So Anderson was also interested not just to read him in English. He started studying Spanish in order to read Rizal in the original Spanish. So he read about 7 different languages. So he and I think, learned our Spanish by reading Rizal in the original. And I was explaining to him that the first time I read Rizal in the original, one of my mentors was saying, since you read him in college and in high school, you know the story in English. So if you read it in the original Spanish with the dictionary, you can get the sense of it. And so we read the novels together, studied Rizal together, and he started writing a lot of material on Rizal, Isabelo de los Reyes, etc. I visited him in Cornell once, and Professor Abinales was still writing his PhD. We had vowed that we would finish our PhDs. I did not finish mine, but it was Ben Anderson who actually also got me into London. He chose my supervisor, chose where I would go, and it was only when I was living in London that I discovered who he was. Everyone was just terrified that you're recommended by Anderson, you don't have to do coursework. And I said, who is he? And because I had not read until I went to London, I didn't read Imagined Community. So it was interesting to meet him on a personal level, to see this man who the many UP professors wanted to meet and who would not give them the time of day. But he attended an undergrad Rizal class in the University of the Philippines with me. And it shows you how humble and curious the man is, and that shines out in a lot of his writing. But I don't want to hog into this. We'll listen to Professor Abinales, and maybe later on we can exchange through conversation. Sorry,
I forgot to thank you, Ambeth. And for people who are needing translation, there is real-time German translation for the event. The devices are at the back. So I forgot to remind people. My apologies. But thank you, Professor Ambeth Ocampo. Now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Professor Patricio N. Abinales, who is a retired professor from the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and he just retired in 2025. He's the author and co-author of the following books: Presidents, Pests, Cosmopolitans, and Communists, Making Mindanao, Cotabato, and Davao in the Formation of the Philippine Nation-State, State and Society in the Philippines, co-authored with Donna J. Amoroso, The Contemporary World, co-authored with Lisandro Claudio, Orthodoxy and History in the Muslim Mindanao Narrative, Fellow Traveler, Essays on Filipino Communism, and the second edition, Making Mindanao, and then finally, Images of State Power, Essays on Philippine Politics from the Margins. Abinales is currently working on 2 books. The first one is on fraternity violence and the making of a new Filipino elite, and then a handbook on Filipino cuisines. So, Jojo, please.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be very quick. Ben was my dissertation advisor. He took me in 1987, despite having 3 Fs in my resume. He went back to the Philippines in 1986 after vowing not to go back as long as Marcos was in power. First thing he did was to go around the country to look for one former guerrilla, young guerrilla, who took him around before martial was declared. It turned out that guy was killed by his own comrades. He joined a coup. He was in the middle of a coup, hiding cover in the Mormon church in 1987 as the Marines were attacking the beleaguered government of Cory Aquino. And he also went to get drunk with the colonel who was the patrons of one of these anti-communist vigilante group that used to kill their victims and eat their liver. He was there in 86. In fall 1988, he came back with a 50-page annotated bibliography commentary on the English translation of Noli Me Tangere by Leon Marie Guerrero. And typically of Ben, the first question he asks is, what's odd about this? And he found out several things. One, it was bowdlerized. It was deprived of its European setting. It was de-Manilized. It was, delocalized. And one of the things that disappeared is laughter. So the first thing he asked in our class was, where is the laughter coming from? So when you read the Noli in German, you ask yourself, not who is laughing, but where is the laughter coming from? And this is where Rizal said was very interesting, because he's not only somebody who writes about you, he welcomes you. Come with me and let's go look around the corruption of colonial society. With all this, corrupt friars, corrupt officials, Filipinos who think they're Spaniards, Spaniards who are carpetbaggers, and all the dregs of society. And you're supposed to look at it from above and then raise up and see your own corrupt society. So you have the corrupt friars here. You go up and you see corrupt politicians, corrupt senators, corrupt congressmen, military men, all that. But that, what he noticed, had disappeared because the Philippine state has made sure that Rizal should be pushed farther into the past so that Filipinos today could not go up and see, damn it, they just changed the Spaniards. It's all Filipinos, but they're all bastards. So that's the first interesting thing. But in a very weird way, he invites the reader. He's a tour guide. And the second thing he says is, and what Ben explained is that, in looking at town, at the society, you laugh and then you stand up and say, we're Filipinos. That's how I identify with them. So that's the first thing that he always said. I think it's my friend Carol Howe was the one who tried to answer the question, where is the laughter coming from? The third thing that was interesting about him is he quotes in his second book, The Spectre of Comparison, which is from Rizal. El demonio de las comparaciones. So what he's trying, this is typically Anderson, which is you have to start thinking comparatively. But among Filipinos, you compare the Philippines to Latin America. They were the Latin America of Southeast Asia. But if you look at Rizal's first chapter, Noli, here's Ibarra, the main character, thinking of Manila Gardens and then Germany. Who would ever think of comparing the Philippines to Germany? Okay. And that's typically Ben. He calls it the beauty of negative comparisons. And he did two things. And the other thing about Filipinos is that we always have this, oppressed relationship with the Americans. But if you apply El Demonio de las Comparaciones and think of Manila's corruption vis-a-vis Boston, if you think of Christian majority discrimination against Muslim, American South. And then what happens then is America and the Philippines becomes like this. Instead of Filipinos complaining up and down. And so my dissertation was to say, the Americans, New York, Manila politics, Muslims, they're not different from Chicago. Chicago then disappears, and this is to be unique in a certain way, going against the theory that America, United States, is exceptional. So that's the second thing. So he does that, let an economist compare a book on poetry in his class. Let a scholar, a student of English, in humanities, let her read a course on a book on econometrics, and what happens. So it's leveling the comparison. And the second thing about this is the margins become the center. So always in Ben's, Anderson's question is always, how do you make the margin the center? Using the same data that people writing the center used to describe the margins. So one of the things I learned from him is if you stand on the bottom most southern point of the Philippines, which is Muslim, and you look up north, what does Philippine history look like? For a Muslim who has been marginalized, oppressed, exploited, humiliated, discriminated by the Christian state. What does Philippine history look like? And you say, nothing. The final point is, what he found interesting about Rizal is how impish Rizal is. And the question is, why did he write it in Spanish? He wrote it in Spanish because everybody wrote in Spanish in the colonial world, and in Spain. But the other interesting thing about reading the Noli are the entries of Spanish, a Filipino, Latin words, and curses to boot. Why did he do that? Because it's his way of saying to the Spaniards, we can read you, but you cannot read us. In the same way now that, for example, so he says, then you have to you can make fun of the colonizers. And that is one thing that he taught us. Okay? Make fun of the colonizers. So in my American politics class, I say, our warlord reminds you of Huey Long in Louisiana. And all my classmates are not doing American politics, like, where the heck, who? So that is the beauty of having Anderson as a professor. He was a difficult man because if he gets curious about footnotes, he'd go to the libraries and come back to you and said, you translated this wrong. So it was a game of chicken with him. I speak Visayan, he speaks Filipino, Tagalog. So I put all my footnotes in Visayan knowing that he wouldn't understand it. But he still found a way to find the answer. So I wrote a 675 monstrosity of a footnote because Benedict Anderson, was a challenge, say, really, difficult but funny, fun mentor to be with. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professors Ocampo and Abinales. I'm going to open the floor now for questions or comments. We have around 30 minutes. Anybody wants to say anything? Yes, please.
Hello. So something that comes up again in relation to Anderson and Rizal was his critique, or rather commentary, on the fact that Rizal wrote in Spanish, intending to criticize the conquerors of the Philippines at the time. So I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that specifically, as people who do speak, native Filipino languages.
Well, we do know that after publishing El Filibusterismo, Rizal attempted to write a book in Tagalog. It's not well known that he actually admits that how come my people have not read the book, because it's in Spanish. So he didn't have the time to translate the Noli into Tagalog, but his elder brother, Pasiano, did. And we are told that Pasiano completed the Tagalog translation of the Noli, and Jose Rizal corrected it. So if that were published, that would have been the definitive Tagalog translation. But unfortunately, according to Pasiano's grandchildren, they remember seeing this manuscript, but it cannot be found. So he started work on a funny novel, a third novel, of which only one chapter in Tagalog remains. It's called Makamisa. It's not the title of the novel, it's the title of a chapter. So he wrote this. It's a very funny novel about a town that is terrified of its parish priest. So the opening scene is the priest is in a hurry to finish mass, and all the manangs in front are guessing why he's in a bad mood. Maybe he didn't wake up. They didn't give him chocolate. He probably has a bad tummy or he has diarrhea. And when they leave the church, they tell their husbands what's happening. So after an hour, the whole town is terrified because the priest is angry. Now, I'd like to think that after he wrote that, like many Filipinos, I'd love to write in Filipino, I can speak it, but to write in it is a different thing. So at one point he decided, I won't continue this. So he started writing in Spanish again and finished 245 pages in Spanish. And that is a manuscript that I found in the National Library that was mislabeled by a librarian who labeled it as the drafts of the Noli Me Tangere. And it was lying in plain sight for about a century. So when I found it and I transcribed it, I realized if these are the drafts of the Noli, how come there are no characters? So I was able to put them together, and it became my MA thesis, which is Makamisa, the search for Rizal's third novel. But it shows you that Rizal wanted to, but felt that it would take too much time or effort to do so and left the Tagalog to someone else. Not that he didn't want to, but he was more fluent in Spanish than in Tagalog. Written. Yeah. Sorry for the long answer.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi. I will declare an interest in this a little bit as David Guerrero. I'm the son of the translator Leon Maria, and I'm coming to this quite late in terms of the Anderson debate over the translations. But I have noticed that he's essentially, a lot of the fault he finds with the translations which were made in the 1960s are essentially judging it by the standards of the 1990s. And there was a major shift in translation practice from the 60s to the 90s. And in the 60s, people were prioritizing readability, mass audiences, publishers were demanding a certain, sort of acceptability. They weren't so keen on foreign names, etc. By the time the 1990s have come along, of course, people are saying, we want, to throw off the shackles of European, whatever, we want to see things in their original language. Now, I think I think there's a lot, obviously, to commend with your professor's analysis of the Nolly translation, but I do feel that he doesn't take that into account. In the sense, there's a bit of sort of presentism in how he analyzes it. He doesn't sort of account for the fact that the Guerrero translation was made in the 60s, and that he's essentially imposing standards from the 1990s and the 2000s onwards. So I'm not sure whether it's an entirely framed comparison in that sense. He's analyzing it as if the translation had been made in the present day, but actually the translation had been made 40 years previously.
But if you look at this article, Hard to Imagine, it actually tries to explain that, which is in the 50s, these people were building the state, yeah. And in building the state, they're basically saying, we've done with the Spaniards. Okay, we've overthrown the Spaniards. So there's nothing there from the Spanish era that a Filipino in the 1950s after World War should be concerned with. Anderson then looked at it from the 90s and realized that, the 1950s Filipinos were already corrupt. Okay, much of our politicians were corrupt. There was massive corruption. There was a peasant rebellion in the 50s. There was a massive migration of peasants from the north to the south, Muslims being marginalized. Okay, Americans, the CIA was very much involved in dictating foreign politics. That has disappeared. So the way Rizal has been taught and translated in the 50s is to really say, those are gone. We're now into the glorious, we're going to move forward as the next South Asian giant. But in the 1990s, then you realize, wait a second, what happened in Spain, the Spanish era, is still being replicated now in the 50s and the 60s and the 80s. Marcos dictatorship, after 86, the return of local power, politicians. And so what he's saying, what he was trying to, that's why he liked Soledad Lacson's translation. He said, there's therefore a need to look at the translations, the original again. And one of the things you have to put in back are the curses, the Tagalogs, the images of what the Philippines was, Manila, Europe, to get young Filipinos angry again. But what has happened in that is that Filipinos now cannot see a connection. The only thing that Filipinos remember about Rizal is to say, those of you who do not look at the past will repeat the problems of the future. No, the past is still here. It's everyone's the present one. So that was what Ben was playing with. And there's a lot of disagreement with it, but I think that's right. The laughter disappeared. And one of the things he wants to bring back is to make how Filipinos, the laughter of Filipinos, and especially the use of that laughter to depoliticize, to delegitimize the ruling elite of this country, of the country. And, I agree. I mean, it's different interpretation, but that's how I interpreted it.
And I comment on that. We discussed this when he was writing the essay. And I told him, it's very clear if you read the preface to the Guerrero translation, I'm writing this, I'm doing a new English version for an English reading public. So that's why he cut out. So if you actually read it, Rizal writes very long roundabout sentences, and Guerrero tightened it. So he made that translation for a particular time, for a particular audience. So I told him, we cannot judge it with the lens of today. And at the time, Ben was happy with the Lacson Locsin translation, but later on, he found it faulty. So our problem is actually finding a translation that will bring us as close to the Spanish as possible, and yet make it readable to the 20th, 21st century. Our problem is when young people read the Noli today, they cannot read it without notes. And Ben Anderson kept telling me, for example, you have to finish your annotations, which I've been doing forever. He says, I will not live to see this done. And because there's certain things that are gone. No? So if you don't do a proper edition, I'd like to think that when we were studying Shakespeare, we used the Folger edition. So there's this old Shakespeare on the left, but the right was all footnotes to help you understand the primary text. No? So like today I was looking at couldn't find it in the German translation. My acid test for a translation of the Noli, which nobody seems to have gotten except Augenbaum, he got it half correct, is there is a scene in the beginning where Ibarra is going up the house of Capitan Tiago, and he says, he talks to the reader. We get to this place called the Caída, and I don't know why they call it this. Caída comes from the Spanish caer, meaning to fall. But this area is on the top of the stairs. So it was a pun. How can you fall when get to the top of the stairs? Nobody has gotten it right except Augenbaum, who asks the question, why will you fall when you get to the top of the stairs? And the answer to that, which is in one of my notes, is when women ascended stairs, they lifted their skirts, went up, held the hem of their skirts, and when they got to the landing, they let it go. So literally, it is the place where the hem of the skirt falls. So again, it's very obscure information, right? But if you don't get that right, you will not find it. And before the Guerrero translation, the one that we used in school was the Derbyshire translation, which I feel is the closest to the Spanish when you listen to it. But the problem with it is all the funny, rude, bastos parts are all removed. No? So all the Filipinisms are removed. There's a whole section on food, different types of fish, how is this cooked? That's all removed because he did not think that was important. Or there is somebody taking a shit in the bushes, which Rizal describes, but when you read the Derbyshire, the guy's already closing his pants. So you don't know what he was doing before. So again, finding the right translation at this time. That's why for me, Guerrero for readability, Lacson Locsin if you want a sense of what the Spanish sounds like. We actually lost our chance in 1996. I was telling the Centennial Commission we should have asked Nick Joaquin to translate them because he did almost all of Rizal's poetry and plays. But they gave him a commission to write a biography which wasn't very good. He would have been perfect to translate it because he was adept at both languages and he knew the context of the novels. But I'd like to think we will see a suitable translation sometime.
Just on the continuing subject of translations and catching a flavor and the Bastos jokes. I'm curious, I cannot read German, but I know that the previous session where you launched this new book about German translation of Noli and Fili. I just remember a kind of a problem. My wife is German. No, she's not German. Mein Frau ist nicht Deutsch, she's Bayerisch. Anyway, she was asked by Corina Velasco to start translating the book of Eric Gamalinda about Hermano Pule. My wife has been very sick, but she was able to get one chapter done. And then Karina, I don't know if she's here, passed it on to a German reader. And then he said, "What's this? It's so..." I guess he was a Hochdeutsch reader, maybe, and expected it to be in a formal Deutsch. But I think my wife was trying to catch that flavor of Hermano Pule. So, would this also be a problem now with these two books that were translated today? Do we have any idea whether somehow yung humor natin, yung pagbibiro at whether that is our humorous side can be captured in that?
Ambeth, do you want to take this? Thank you.
No, actually, even in Spanish, there's a problem with an edition of Rizal. No, the late Pedro Ortiz Armengol, who is a Galdós expert, wanted to do an edition of the Spanish editions of Rizal, but had a problem with the Royal Academy of Language that said, no, we have to correct all these wrong Spanish. But then that is the part of what it is. There is Philippine Spanish. It will not pass the Royal Academy standards, but then it has a voice of its own, which should be allowed to do so. So you can see that it's not just in translation, but even in Spanish, there are questions of what should we correct his Filipinized Spanish or keep it as is. So there are big questions on translations and editions.
I think the best test of that is if the German readers start laughing. If they start laughing on Rizal, the novel, then they might get it.
Okay,
they laugh with Rizal.
We have
invites them into the novel
we have 5 minutes left, and I want to use the moderator's privilege to ask a question. So Anderson's favorite character in Indonesian history was Tan Malaka, who was a communist and he was violent. In fact, he was close to some of the most violent colonels in the Indonesian army, most bloodthirsty. And yet his favorite character in the Philippines is Jose Rizal, a liberal who was not violent and who stayed away from violence and used the pen. How come his favorite Filipino is so different from his favorite Indonesian?
He refers to Rizal as Lolo Rizal, Grandpa, Lolo Jose. Which I think, if you think of imagined communities, okay, and one of the fascinating things about imagined communities, it's a book that makes fun of the Brits. It's actually not for anybody else, for the British to make fun and to say, nationalism, oh, it came from the Philippines, America. And so he found in Rizal, but the one thing that's missing in imagined communities is to find a character that's starting to evolve from a colonial subject into somebody who starts thinking of the nation. That's why he fell in love with Rizal precisely, because one of the books that it's published in the Philippines, but which I think recommend should be translated to German, is this book of Ben on why counting counts, wherein he lists down the different categories of characters in Philippine colonial society. So Chinese Filipinos, half Filipinos, mulattoes, mestizos, and all that. And you have this, you can actually see this guy figuring out who we were. And there is Tan Malaka, this has been in the 60s, no? The Indonesian, it's against the Dutch already. But in Rizal, this is the character that he really associates himself with. The guy who wrote about nationalism, imagined communities, he could not imagine rereading imagined communities without reading Rizal. That's why if you read, it's a fascinating book. I mean, it basically makes fun of the West. And for him, his idol is Lolo Jose.
I'll escape that question. You need to write a doctoral dissertation on to answer that. But yeah, I think he was interested in people who were fighting with ideas, fighting with literature, and that was the thing that fascinated him. Also to look at the country's history through its literature. So. We don't know really why, but thank you very much for that.
Jojo, Ambeth, thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you very much for staying